Sometimes, a forgotten envelope, a single old postcard, holds a truth deeper than death itself. This is the story of a secret buried beneath years of silence, until one woman unknowingly pulled it back into the light. But what she uncovered wasn't what she expected. It wasn't just a message. It was a wound, a final plea, sent too late, and a death, not by poison nor violence, but by guilt, by memory, and a letter that arrived when it no longer mattered. Are you ready to hear the truth, the one that was never meant to be spoken? It was one of those strangely poised mornings in Elmridge Hollow, when even time itself seemed reluctant to move forward, as if the village had slipped briefly into a forgotten pocket between moments, and the air, heavy with the scent of lavender and damp stone, carried a hush that made the birdsong feel like an intrusion. Beneath the ivy-laced bay window of a modest brick manor stood Miss Agatha Wren, a woman of meticulous habits and hidden histories, her hands sheathed in worn leather gloves, and her wide-brimmed hat shading eyes that had seen too much and spoken too little. She was tending to her garden with the reverence one might give to a cathedral, kneeling beside a vine of antique bleeding hearts that arched like sorrowful chandeliers over the mossy path, when she heard the soft patter of footsteps, hasty, uncertain, followed by the rasp of a gate latch lifting in breathless urgency. She straightened slowly, brushing a smear of soil from her sleeve, just as Mrs. Gilda Hemsley, the village's most recent and overly excitable arrival, stumbled into view with cheeks flushed and curls escaping from her scarf, waving a folded newspaper in one hand and practically vibrating with untold news. "Agatha, forgive me, but this was found this morning, just lying there in the wire tray at the old telegraph counter. No stamp, no return, just 6 words. Forgive me. It's too late, that's all. Nothing else. Isn't that strange?" Her voice was pitched high, but her eyes sparkled with something darker than mere curiosity. Miss Wren didn't speak at once. Instead, she turned back to her flowers and gently clipped a sagging stem, as though weighing the balance of life and death in its droop. "Too late for what?" she murmured, not asking so much as reflecting, her voice barely louder than the breeze that stirred the lilies nearby. She had learned over long and quiet years that some truths revealed themselves only when invited politely, never demanded, and so with the air still tingling with that odd unsettling phrase, she later made her way to the village post hall, a building of stone and shadow, where dust danced in slanting shafts of morning light, and the brass bell above the door gave a lonely, tired chime as she entered. Behind the counter stood Miss Cora Bell, a woman whose stern exterior was shaped as much by loss as by duty, her grey cardigan perfectly buttoned, her silver bun wound tight as a clock spring, who looked up only briefly, recognizing Agatha with the faintest of nods. They exchanged quiet greetings, discussed a long-delayed parcel of Devonshire lace thread, and then with a tilt of the head and the gentleness of a scalpel, Miss Wren said, "Gilda mentioned something peculiar. A postcard, perhaps?" Miss Bell paused, just a moment, but in it, a century seemed to pass, then reached below the counter and produced a small cream-coloured card, its corners frayed just enough to suggest age without origin. The handwriting was elegant but strained, and the ink had bled softly into the fibres of the paper. "Forgive me, it's too late." "No address," Miss Bell whispered, "no stamp. I nearly threw it out, but the penmanship, it felt familiar, though I can't place it, and something about it chilled me." Miss Wren turned the card over slowly, her fingertips lingering on the edges as though hoping it might whisper something only she could hear. "Sometimes," she said, almost to herself, "it's not the absence of names that disturbs us, it's that we recognize what we shouldn't." She handed the card back with care. "Who came in this morning?" Miss Bell consulted the mental ledger she carried like scripture. "Only a few. Ellis Morningside, Miss Pruitt, and Harold Crowthorne. That was before 11. The name struck the air like a dropped coin in a deep well, barely a sound but impossible to ignore. And by evening, that quiet name had spread like spilt ink across Elmridge Hollow, not through phones or letters, but through cracked windows, clinking teacups and lowered voices. Harold Crowthorne, the former headmaster of the old grammar school and a man of towering silence, had been found dead in his study, slumped forward over his blotter, a half-written letter still uncapped beside his hand. His spectacles slid halfway down the bridge of his nose as if he had simply closed his eyes mid-thought. They said it was heart failure, but Miss Wren, who did not believe in accidents of timing, merely set aside her crochet work, donned her walking shoes, and made her way to the vicarage, where the Reverend's wife, always eager to offer second-hand details with first-rate conviction, poured tea she would not drink, and spoke of things she had not seen, while Agatha listened in silence, her gaze fixed not on the words but on the flicker of gaslight against the tea's surface, waiting as always for the faint ripple that came not from what was said, but from what was very carefully not. It had been 3 days since the bell in Cold Hollow's clock tower had fallen mysteriously silent, a minor detail for most, but not for Miss Evelyn Thorne. who regarded such absences with the same scrutiny others might reserve for broken windows or bloodstains. The village had long depended on the bell to mark the passing of hours and lives, and its sudden silence felt like an omen disguised in rust and disrepair. On the morning of the third day, Evelyn sat beneath the mullioned light of her parlour, a shawl draped over her shoulders and her hands resting on a small envelope, unsealed, slightly crumpled, and curiously blank on the inside save for the phrase, "I shouldn't have come back." No name, no address, only the faintest scent of pipe smoke and something older, old wood or dust perhaps, that clung to the paper like guilt. She had found it at her doorstep, precisely folded into the latest copy of the Cold Hollow Gazette, which itself bore no unusual markings, except that she had never subscribed to it. Across the street, the new resident at Greystone Cottage, Mr. Alaric Dawn, a man of unsettling precision and bone-white posture, was seen that very morning trimming his hedges with the meticulousness of someone suppressing greater violence. He had arrived 3 months prior under the vague pretense of retirement from government work, though no one could say exactly what kind. Since then, he had become both a fixture and a mystery, appearing at the bakery precisely at 9 each morning, yet never staying longer than a minute, and asking questions that sounded harmless until later reflection turned them sinister. That same afternoon, during tea at the Green Fig Tea Room, the conversation naturally turned toward the bell, the letter, and the absence of young Mr. Linden, the vicar's assistant, who had not been seen since the previous Sunday. "He was meant to read the sermon," murmured Mrs. Ulbridge, staring into her lemon tea as if it might clarify the timeline. Instead, there was just silence, and that poor girl from the choir trembling like a leaf. Evelyn Thorne, her mind a quiet storm of patterns and premonitions, spoke at last. "It's not the things we find that matter most, it's the things that vanish without explanation. A bell, a boy, a name from a letter." The others blinked, unsettled but unsure why, as if they'd all just been nudged toward a truth their minds weren't quite ready to grasp. By twilight, news had spread, quietly in that cold, hollow way, through glances over teacups and hedgerows. Someone had broken into the church crypt. Nothing stolen, no signs of forced entry, but the lock had been replaced, not broken, and no one knew who had the key. Evelyn visited the vicarage just after dusk, her footsteps echoing like soft warnings on the flagstone path, and as she stepped inside, she found the vicar himself, pale, shaking, and holding a page from an old parish register that bore only one entry circled in red ink: Alaric Dawn, buried 1893. The room grew colder, though no window was open, and the silence that followed was not the silence of peace, but of something watching, waiting, and not yet done. Evelyn did not scream, she merely folded the register shut, returned it to the vicar's trembling hands and whispered, "Some bells toll long after the body is gone. Some names return not to haunt us, but to finish what was never truly buried." Miss Eliza Haythorne had lived in Ivy Hollow House for as long as memory allowed. A house that had grown so silent over the years, it seemed to inhale more than it exhaled, and on that overcast morning, she sat in its drawing room, where shadows clung to the cornices like gossip too old to be useful, but too stubborn to fade. In her lap rested a violet envelope, the kind no post office issued any more, sealed not with wax but with something brittle and ancient, pressed heather, browned with age, its delicate stalks arranged in a way that felt intentional, like a message in a forgotten dialect. The envelope had no stamp, no postmark, and yet it had appeared inside the family Bible between the brittle pages of Lamentations, though Eliza had not opened that Bible in over a year, not since the day the wind had burst through the windows during a storm, and the page had landed unchosen, on "Thou hast removed my soul far off from peace, I forgat prosperity." The timing of the envelope's appearance could not be ignored. It was the morning after Nathaniel Blythe's death, when the Moor Bridge had supposedly taken him during a foggy evening walk, though Eliza knew that bridge well and fog better, and neither had ever seemed like things Nathaniel would lose himself in. He was careful, methodical, and he never walked without his lantern, yet the lantern was found unbroken by the water's edge, upright, its flame still faintly warm. Eliza had not wept, not publicly, but the stillness inside her had deepened, like a well left untended. She had seen him only the day before his death, standing beneath the chapel's bell tower, staring not upward, where the great iron bell loomed dormant, but downward toward the ground, his eyes tracking the uneven stones as though reading names that no longer existed. That image wouldn't leave her. And now this envelope, this unasked-for interruption, this whisper from a hand she had never touched, and yet somehow recognized. What did it want? Outside, the trees groaned as the wind passed through, making the garden gate creak on its rusted hinge, a sound so familiar it usually faded into the backdrop, but today it made her turn, just slightly, as if something might be standing there. She didn't open the envelope immediately. Instead, she made tea, set out 1 cup, though habit had once made her set 2, and stared at the fire that hadn't been lit since April. The room smelled of dried roses, old varnish, and something more elusive, like forgotten ink. At 3 o'clock, dressed in a navy coat and gloves stitched by her mother decades ago, Eliza left the house, walked past the hollow oaks and the cold stone bench where Lydia Ward used to sit with a sketchbook, and stopped at the old telephone box near the village green, the one no longer in service but which now and then still rang without explanation. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, resting on the cracked floor, was a slip of paper, yellowed, water-stained, and bearing only 5 words: "She never left." Not really. Her breath caught, not in fear but in recognition. The handwriting matched the envelope. That evening she attended a small tea gathering at Mrs. Langtry's home, where the chatter was soft, filtered through the clink of porcelain and the occasional sigh. There, someone uttered Lydia Ward's name, quietly, almost reverently, as if saying it too loudly would summon something. "She was engaged to Nathaniel, you know," murmured Mr. Cavendish, stirring his cup but not drinking. "Before the scandal, before Wenscombe." A silence followed, as if the room itself held its breath. No one explained what the scandal was, no one ever did. As the lamplight flickered and the room settled into a heavy quiet, Eliza felt as if she were surrounded not by neighbors, but by actors in a scene they had long rehearsed, only now realizing someone was watching. She left just before dusk. The envelope remained unopened on her desk until the sky had turned the color of bruised lavender. When she finally broke the seal and unfolded the contents, there was no letter, only a photograph, sepia-toned, curling at the corners of 2 figures standing on the chapel steps. Nathaniel was one. The other was a woman, half turned toward him, her face in profile, hair dark and pinned high, mouth slightly parted as if speaking just as the shutter closed. The back of the photograph bore a short message in delicate lavender-colored ink: "The living forget, but stone remembers." Eliza stared at the words until they began to blur. She rose slowly and moved to the window. Beyond the fog-laced trees, she could see the outline of the chapel bell tower in the distance, and for a moment, just a flicker of a second, she thought she saw a figure standing beneath it again, motionless, staring not up at the bell but down at the earth. The letter arrived just past dawn, slipped beneath the swollen, weather-warped door of Briar Hollow Cottage, as the sky outside still wore the pale blush of early light, and though the sound was faint, a mere rustle against the floorboards, it was enough to stir Eleanor Prescott from her trance-like silence at the kitchen table, where she sat with hands wrapped around a cold, untouched cup of tea. The envelope lay there like a relic out of place, pale blue, thick with the kind of quality paper no one used anymore, and scented very faintly, with a curious blend of lavender and something far older, something almost mineral, like damp earth after a burial. There was no postmark, no stamp, no inked routing address, only a name on the front, written in careful calligraphic strokes that made her fingers tremble as she reached for it: Clarissa Mallory. It had been 32 years since Eleanor had seen or spoken that name aloud, and even then, it had been in whispers and unfinished thoughts, spoken behind shuttered windows in the days following the disappearance that no one dared call by its true name. The town of Ashcombe had moved on, or pretended to. The official record said Clarissa had withdrawn from school just before the Jubilee, and the village council had closed the matter without so much as a question. But Eleanor remembered that final week in vivid fragments, Clarissa laughing beside the ivy wall, tracing invisible symbols into the soft dirt beneath the playground tree, scribbling frantically during afternoon composition, only to tear the pages and toss them into the old well behind the chapel. Eleanor remembered the last time she saw her twilight, blurring the edges of the school grounds, Clarissa's silhouette by the garden gate, holding a gold locket that caught the fading sun like a flame, and how she seemed to vanish into the mist rather than walk through it. Her body was never found, neither was her suitcase. Only the locket remained, discovered by the groundskeeper on the chapel steps the next morning, its clasp broken and chain twisted like something had tugged too hard. Now, decades later, this envelope appeared from nowhere, and inside it was no letter, only a photograph folded once along its age-softened spine. The image was haunting: the Ashcombe garden at dawn, cloaked in morning fog, 2 girls standing near the old apple tree. One was unmistakably Clarissa, her blue ribbon-pleated skirt, and the same distant, unreadable expression she wore in all her school pictures. The other figure was harder to make out, half obscured by the glare of the sun and the slight blur of motion, taller, perhaps older, face turned just enough to be unreadable as if the camera had hesitated. On the back, scrawled in that same graceful hand, were the words, "You were right not to forget." The moment Eleanor read those words, a strange sensation crept up her spine. Not fear exactly, but recognition, like the echo of a voice she hadn't heard in years whispering just behind her ear. All day she moved through the house as if it were underwater, disconnected, dazed, as memories she had long sealed behind mental walls began to seep through the cracks. By mid-afternoon she found herself walking the winding path to the eastern edge of the village, the letter hidden beneath her coat, her steps unsteady but urgent. There stood Bernard Keene's ivy-covered cottage, the windows fogged with age, and inside the man himself, older, greyer and more brittle than she remembered, greeted her with a startled hesitation. She didn't sit. She asked him plainly, "Do you remember Clarissa Mallory?" And he, after a pause that stretched too long, replied with the kind of rehearsed nonchalance that fools no one, "Of course, but that was a long time ago." She noticed his hand tremble as he reached for the teacups, noticed too how his eyes darted to the bookshelf where a red journal stuck out just slightly from the rest. "She had a brother," he muttered, half to himself. "Didn't last long here, said he saw something near the quarry, something he shouldn't have." The silence that followed was dense, as if the walls themselves were listening. Eleanor didn't press. She simply nodded, thanked him and walked back through the village, past the crumbling post office where something strange caught her eye. A girl, no older than 15, wearing a moss-colored coat and boots far too thin for the weather, stood staring at the faded notices as if reading something urgent in their decay. When Eleanor passed, the girl turned briefly and smiled, but her eyes weren't smiling. There was something uncanny in them, something knowing. Without a word, she turned and walked down the narrow path behind the churchyard, the very same overgrown trail Clarissa used to sneak down when she thought no one saw. That night, unable to rest, Eleanor retrieved an old shoebox from the back of her closet, filled with pressed flowers, torn notebook pages, and the final fragment of Clarissa's last composition. She had read it dozens of times over the years, but now she noticed something new. The handwriting changed midway through, from Clarissa's delicate curves to a jagged, heavier script, with one final line scrawled faintly at the bottom in pencil. "I told them not to open the door, but someone already had." As the room filled with the slow creak of old beams and the faint tap of wind against the shutters, Eleanor felt the first pulse of real dread. She went to the kitchen, poured herself a fresh cup of tea, hands still trembling, and sat staring at the envelope for what felt like hours. At exactly 4:03 a.m., when even the birds were silent, there came 3 deliberate knocks at the back door, slow, precise, like someone who already knew she was awake. It was one of those windless, overcast mornings in Grafton Hollow, where even the trees stood still, as though the village itself were holding its breath, not out of fear, but anticipation, like something long buried was preparing to resurface. Miss Evelyn Hartwell, who had arrived only a fortnight earlier, under the soft, socially acceptable veil of tending to her deceased aunt's neglected property, was already drawing quiet attention, not for anything she did overtly, but for the careful way she listened, the way her eyes lingered half a second too long, and the unnerving precision with which she asked about men and events no longer part of the public memory. Her interest, she claimed, was in wartime service records, particularly of those who had served not in battle but in logistics, records management and post-conflict civilian operations, innocuous roles on paper, but ones that often brushed close to darker undertones of secrecy, displacement and unsanctioned authority. But it was one name, Nathaniel Greybourne, that threaded itself like a ghost through her inquiries, a name half remembered by the elderly and avoided by those who still recalled the uneasy air that hung around the man like mist. Mrs. Penrose, the former headmistress, stiffened ever so slightly when Evelyn brought it up during a casual chat over lemon tea, muttering something vague about strange habits and an incident at the manor, then retreating swiftly into talk of weather and church repairs. Evelyn merely smiled and changed the subject, but in her coat pocket, her fingers tightened around a folded letter she'd found hidden in the lining of a broken trunk in the attic, a letter not addressed to her aunt, but to someone named Ellis and signed simply N.G. It was in the town council archives that Evelyn's visits grew more focused, though still draped in plausible curiosity, poring over inspection reports from 1947, requisition records of properties used by the War Office, and most notably the restricted notes of a now-defunct psychiatric advisory board. Miss Alderton, the quiet archivist, noted her unusual persistence but said nothing, until Evelyn casually inquired whether there were ever cases of unmarked civilian transfers logged between the ministry and coastal rehabilitation sites. "I believe it was part of resettlement procedures," Evelyn offered, with that soft, almost hypnotic tone of someone used to not being questioned. The mention of Greybourne resurfaced when she visited Reverend Clay, newly appointed and disarmingly open, at least until Evelyn asked, ever so gently, if the old chapel had any record of unregistered burials from the post-war period. Clay, to his credit, smiled kindly, but his eyes clouded, and he murmured something about sealed documents and prior clergy discretion, the kind of practiced vagueness that suggested a history no one wanted touched. That evening, under candlelight, Evelyn sat alone in the crumbling parsonage study, the scent of mold and secrets thick in the air, and spread before her were fragments she had collected, a cracked photograph of 5 unnamed men in uniform, one of whom bore an uncanny resemblance to Greybourne, another marked with an ink cross, and on the back a scribbled phrase half erased by time. Only one came back, but he brought the others with him. Her journal, bound in fading black leather, now contained meticulous notations, not just in English, but in an obscure cipher used by a wartime psychological evaluation corps. Evelyn wasn't just tracing a family line, she was reconstructing something deliberately forgotten. Something institutional. Something meant to disappear. And as the fire cracked low in the hearth and the old pipes groaned like distant voices, Evelyn Hartwell realized she was no longer merely investigating the past. She was walking its narrow path, and it was beginning to walk back toward her. The record wasn't uncovered beneath grand chandeliers in some pristine archive, but in the humblest corner of the vestry, buried behind rusting hymnals and moth-eaten vestments in a warped drawer no one had touched in decades. A forgotten ledger, its leather spine crumbling, its pages dry with age and the scent of old dust and damp stone. Yet within it, a single line etched in fading ink, sliced through time like a blade. Unnamed female infant. Mother. Eliza Marchant. Father. Not recorded. Reverend Alcott, who'd led Lydia Farnsworth into the vestry with the weary politeness of a man used to keeping the past buried, adjusted his spectacles with a trembling hand and mumbled an apology, one that said too little and revealed too much, claiming the 1920s had been a time of upheaval, grief, war, whispers and quiet vanishings that no one ever dared explain aloud. Lydia, poised in her tailored coat with gloves neatly folded in her lap, said nothing at first. She simply leaned in over the ledger, her breath catching just slightly, eyes scanning that solitary entry again and again, as though repetition would draw out more meaning. But the meaning was already thunderously clear. No mention of adoption, no listed guardian, only the vague and unsettling phrase, placed into private spiritual custody, following a discreet dusk baptism, a detail so out of place, so laden with secrecy, that it sent a slow chill through Lydia's spine. Dusk, not dawn, hidden, not hallowed. And Eliza Marchant, the mother named, had left Darnley mere weeks later, her name scrubbed from conversations and her presence forgotten like a smudge wiped from a mirror. But Lydia had come not to study Eliza Marchant as a researcher, despite the fiction she offered the townsfolk about genealogy and local history. She had come to find her, to unearth the buried existence of a woman whose shadow she had lived in all her life. And now, staring at the brittle truth in that ledger, her private suspicion bloomed into terrifying certainty. She was that child, tucked away in silence, hidden from names, from history, from inheritance. Her arrival in Darnley, it now seemed, was not merely timely, it was destined, as though the sins of the past had finally stirred awake the moment Lord Redgrave, an aging patriarch with a smile like a blade, had begun altering the succession of his crumbling estate. Days later, fate, or something far more deliberate, delivered her another puzzle piece, tucked within the pages of a dusty volume in a second-hand bookstore on Bramble Lane, a forgotten photograph, yellowed and brittle, slipped like a warning or a whisper between essays no one had read in years. It showed 3 figures on a wind-swept moor: Eliza Marchant, barely more than a girl, eyes haunted and distant, Lord Redgrave, unmistakable in his haughty posture, and beside them, a third man, tall, tense, his gaze fixed not on the camera but on Eliza herself, one hand raised mid-gesture, as though caught in a plea or a protest, or perhaps something far more tender and far more damning. Lydia studied that moment, frozen in time, and saw what no caption could explain: proximity charged with unspoken weight, a triangle of tension where affection, guilt and betrayal had once combusted behind closed doors. She replaced the photograph in silence, but the storm it stirred within her refused to settle. That same night, someone broke into the solicitor's office, no valuables taken, no drawers rifled through at random. Only one file was missing, one marked confidential, one dated March 1921, bearing the crest of House Redgrave. And when the gossip reached a boiling point the next morning over warm bread and boiled eggs at the bakery, it was Mrs. Welling, the baker's quietly watchful sister-in-law, who leaned close to Lydia and whispered what no one else dared say aloud. The stolen file contained a letter, Eliza's final message never delivered, a letter she had penned just days before she vanished, sealed and entrusted to the solicitor, only to be buried under decades of Redgrave silence. Had it been a confession of paternity, a plea for protection, a demand that could have undone everything? Whatever it was, someone wanted it hidden again, and now Lydia knew. Her search had already roused those who had once buried truth with the same care they buried the dead. The air in Darnley had begun to shift. Eyes watched her from behind lace curtains, locked doors clicked twice instead of once, and in her gut she understood. She was no longer just uncovering the past, she was disturbing the living remnants of it. Every discovery, every whisper, every shadowed record was a chisel against a wall that had long kept the truth sealed away. But Lydia Farnsworth had come too far to stop now, and the past once stirred does not sleep again easily, especially when the blood of the forgotten starts to flow through the living. The village lay cloaked in a silence too heavy to be peaceful. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from serenity, but the kind that whispered of buried secrets and things best left undisturbed. Behind every polite smile hid an unanswered question, and behind every lace-curtained window, eyes watched more than they let on. When Miss Eleanor Gray arrived in the quaint fog-wrapped village to settle into the manor she had inherited from her late great-aunt, few noticed, at least not openly, but her arrival stirred something, like the first gust of wind before a long-awaited storm. One damp, overcast afternoon, Eleanor found herself drawn to the parish archives, a small stone building behind the chapel that smelled of candle wax and forgotten prayers. She hadn't meant to snoop, but when she saw the door slightly ajar and the lock hanging loose, curiosity overtook her. Inside, the light was dim, filtered only by a lone wax candle someone had left burning, as though they meant to return but never did. Drawers stood partially open, one in particular catching her eye. Something about its careless placement felt wrong. Inside, nestled among brittle documents and yellowed baptism records, she discovered an old handwritten note. The ink had faded, the corners curled, but the message struck like thunder. Refer to March 1912, burial altered, identity masked. Eleanor's heart quickened. The note was cryptic, yes, but not meaningless. It suggested the deliberate concealment of someone's identity, perhaps even an entire death altered in the church records. That wasn't something done by accident, that was erasure. Quietly, she slipped the note into her coat pocket, careful not to disturb anything else. That evening, with the weight of the paper pressing against her chest like a secret begging to be heard, she visited Mr. Delaney, the village's aging solicitor. She told him, politely and with practiced calm, that she simply wished to explore her great-aunt's old donation records for historical interest. Mr. Delaney welcomed her with a thin smile, but the moment she casually mentioned the 1912 note, the color drained from his face. His hand trembled ever so slightly as he reached for his spectacles. "That drawer should have been locked," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "I haven't touched it in years." His voice was soft, but his eyes betrayed something deeper, fear or perhaps guilt. From that moment, Eleanor knew she was not the first to chase this ghost. 2 days later, under the thick veil of dusk, Eleanor spotted Mrs. Aldwych, an elderly woman who often hovered around the parish library, standing at the manor's old fireplace. She was burning something. Through a discreet glance from the hallway mirror, Eleanor saw a small envelope turn to ash in the flames. A photograph, partially visible before it crumbled, showed 2 blurred figures, one possibly a man, the other a woman, both facing away from the camera. When Eleanor asked her about it the next morning, the old woman merely replied, "Some memories are better left to dust," to which Eleanor calmly responded, "Memories may turn to ash, but their scent lingers in the air," and linger it did. A few days later, Eleanor paid a visit to the village post office. There, Miss Blunt, the town's sharp-eyed postmistress, hesitantly told her that an unknown woman had arrived late one evening, quietly slipping a thick envelope into the private box. "No stamp, no name, no address," she whispered, lowering her voice as though the shadows themselves might hear. Eleanor gently asked about the envelope, but the moment she did, Miss Blunt's expression shifted. Just for a second, a flicker of recognition or fear crossed her face. She said nothing more, but Eleanor didn't need her to. The pattern was emerging. Someone, or perhaps several people, had gone to great lengths to bury something. But now, the roots of that secret were beginning to twist their way to the surface. Then came the night of the intruder. Eleanor had grown used to the creaks and groans of the old manor, but this was different. It was past midnight when she heard it, a soft rustle near the garden gate, then the unmistakable sound of footsteps padding through the wet grass. From her bedroom balcony, she saw a man, tall, cloaked in shadow, moving deliberately toward the back entrance. He didn't seem like a thief. He wasn't searching for valuables. No, he seemed to know exactly where he was going. She didn't call the police. Not yet. Something told her that this was not about crime. It was about history. A very personal, very dangerous kind of history, and she was now part of it. Each day that followed brought more than just suspicion, it brought pressure. Smiles turned colder, conversations dried up when she entered a room. Even the birds outside the manor windows seemed to sing in warning tones. Yet Eleanor pressed on, combing through old journals, letters and records, piecing together fragments of a life long buried. The burial from 1912, she learned, had been discreet. No public mourning, no grave marked in the cemetery registry. Just a whisper of a name, scratched out in ink, and a hint that someone powerful had made it vanish. The truth, she now suspected, wasn't just about a hidden death. It was about someone who had lived, someone whose identity, if exposed, could still unravel the village's carefully preserved facade. Maybe it was a child born in secrecy. Maybe it was a love affair between the manor's heir and someone deemed unworthy. Or perhaps it was something even darker, something that tied every silent glance, every burned photograph, and every restless night together. Eleanor Gray had come to the village as an outsider, but now the village was inside her, its secrets coiled around her ribs, whispering their truths in the dead of night. And the deeper she dug, the more certain she became. Someone still alive knew the full story. Someone was watching her, and someone was prepared to silence the past again, no matter the cost. The rain had only just stopped when Evelyn Hart stepped off the gravel path and into the derelict railway museum at the edge of Wren's Hollow. Her umbrella dripped quietly onto the cracked stone tiles, the sharp scent of rust and damp oil filling her lungs like an echo from another lifetime. It was never in her plan to enter the building. She had passed it dozens of times during her childhood visits to the village, always warned to keep her distance. "That place is cursed," her grandmother once whispered with eyes too tired to lie. Yet on this particular day, as the last threads of mist clung to the treetops and the silence became almost suffocating, something stronger than curiosity had drawn her there. The sign outside had long faded, the wooden frame splintered by time. But the door, strangely, was open just a crack. Not broken, not forced, just open, like an invitation meant only for her. Inside, the air was heavy, stale in a way that suggested nothing had moved in years. Cobwebs stretched between the ceiling beams like neglected tapestries, and the exhibit's dusty models of trains and tracks seemed frozen in mid-thought. Evelyn walked slowly, her boots creaking against the warped floorboards, each step sounding louder than the last. It was as though the building was listening, or remembering. At the far end of the room, almost hidden behind a tipped-over signal lamp and a rusted conductor's cap, stood an old filing cabinet. Its paint was peeling, and one drawer was halfway open, as if someone had meant to close it but changed their mind at the last moment. Evelyn approached it with the caution of someone trespassing, not just in a place but in a memory. Her fingers hesitated at the handle. Then she pulled. Inside were manila folders, brittle and yellowed, their corners curled with age. She rifled through them slowly until one in particular caught her eye, a leather-bound logbook stamped 1947. As she flipped through it, her heart tightened. Between its pages was a small, dried violet, flattened, preserved, like a ghost pinned in place, and tucked beside it, on faded pale blue stationery, was a note. 5 words, scrawled in careful cursive: "The train never arrived. Forgive me." It was too dangerous to wait. The handwriting stopped her breath. She knew it. It was unmistakably her grandmother's, but her grandmother had died in 1992, and this note was dated only last month. That night, Evelyn lay awake in the guest room of the ivy-choked boarding house where she had checked in under the name Miss Ellery. The old woman who owned the place, Mrs. Kalau, was pleasant enough, though she had a strange way of always being in the hallway whenever Evelyn returned, asking polite but probing questions about her research into the village archives. Evelyn had told no one about her true reason for coming, not the solicitor who handled her grandmother's will, not the post office clerk who had sent her those old estate papers, and certainly not the landlady. And yet someone knew she was here. Someone was watching. The next morning she paid a visit to the parish archives under the pretense of donating to the church restoration fund. Mr. Thorne, the aging clerk, welcomed her with cautious enthusiasm, eager to share what little history he could. But when she asked, casually, carefully, if there had been any accidents or disappearances connected to the railway in the 1940s, his face changed. His hands, moments before busy with dusting old ledgers, froze. "There was a derailment," he said after a pause, eyes fixed on the wall behind her, "back in late 1947. But no names were ever published. Whole thing was hushed up. Government said it was a military supply train, off the record. Nothing to do with locals." His voice wavered, and Evelyn could hear the lie twisting in it. She thanked him politely and left, but not before noticing that his left hand trembled slightly as he slid the drawer shut, like a man afraid he'd just unearthed something long buried. That evening, a postcard appeared beneath her door. No stamp, no return address. Its edges were burned slightly at the corners. The message was brief, scrawled in uneven, frantic handwriting. "You're too close. Go home." The fear in her chest was immediate, primal, but not paralyzing. Because for the first time since her grandmother's death, Evelyn felt something she had not felt in years. Certainty. Certainty that she was chasing the right ghost. What she had uncovered so far painted a haunting outline. A woman in 1947, pregnant and alone, waiting for a train that never arrived. A train that may never have existed on paper, but had existed in someone's life, in her grandmother's life. The timelines matched. The disappearance, the sudden relocation, the secretive adoption, her mother's missing birth certificate. It all circled back to Wren's Hollow. It all circled back to the train station that no longer existed. The next day, Evelyn returned to the museum, this time with a flashlight and a notepad. She traced her fingers along the rusted shell of the engine displayed outside, its number plate removed, its windows shattered by time. She crouched beneath the frame and found, etched faintly in the iron beneath, a name, Agnes, not the name of a train, but the name of a woman, Perhaps the woman who had vanished, perhaps her grandmother's real name. Her heart pounded. She took photos, made sketches, wrote everything down, and when she stood up brushing dirt from her coat, she noticed something even stranger. There were fresh footprints in the gravel behind her. Someone else had been there, or still was. She sat on the edge of the chair, back straight, fingers tightly interlaced in her lap, as though trying to hold herself together from the inside out, the air in the drawing room thick with something unspoken, regret perhaps, or revelation long delayed. The clock ticked with merciless calm, while the faint scent of lavender polish clung to the polished oak furniture, blending with the metallic trace of rain that still lingered on the windows. Across from her, Eliza Crane watched with an expression that held neither pity nor judgment, only a quiet attentiveness born from decades of watching people unravel in the most polite ways. "I've always believed," Eliza began gently, her voice a low murmur against the hush, "that truth doesn't vanish, no matter how deeply we bury it. It waits, patient, stubborn, until someone dares to look it in the eye." Marianne blinked once slowly, her gaze fixed not on Eliza but on the empty space just beyond her shoulder, the place where memories tend to live. "My mother's name was Clara Redthorn," she whispered, and the name seemed to shift the air itself, as though the house had heard and remembered too. "I found her name on the back of a photograph hidden beneath the floorboards of my guardian's study after his death. No one ever told me who she was. I was just there, a ward, a charity case, a quiet girl who asked too many questions." Her voice faltered. "But when I came here I didn't expect to find answers. I only hoped for something, a sign, a crack in the silence." Eliza's eyes softened. "And did you find what you were looking for?" There was a pause, long, aching. Marianne drew in a shaky breath. "She wrote to him. I found the letter. It was folded into quarters, unopened. Her handwriting was still perfect. She asked him to forgive her, to meet her, just once for my sake. But he never replied." The room seemed to darken around the edges, not from shadows but from the weight of things unsaid. "Did you read it?" Eliza asked, her voice nearly lost in the hush. Marianne nodded. She begged him to give me a place in this world, and he died without even reading her words." Eliza leaned forward slightly. "So you posted her letter. You sent it anyway." Marianne didn't answer, but her silence echoed louder than any confession. Eliza reached out, not to scold but to anchor. "We cannot rewrite the past," she said softly, "but we can choose not to continue its silence." Days later, it was a comment from the local innkeeper, an idle remark about a man named Ashford, often seen standing quietly by the weeping stone near the old chapel, that lit the final spark in Eliza's mind. She recalled the portrait hidden in Clara's box, 3 young figures frozen in time, Clara, her brother, and a man whose eyes bore the same haunted sorrow as the stranger called Ashford. She invited him to tea, and he arrived with the air of a man summoned by fate. They spoke of weather and church repairs, of nothing and everything, until Eliza, setting down her teacup with deliberate calm, said, "You were her brother, weren't you?" There was no flinch, only a long exhale, like the air leaving a secret too long held. "There's no hiding anymore, is there?" he murmured. "No," Eliza said gently, "but I wonder why there ever was." He looked down. "I told her to disappear. I thought it was the only way to protect her. I blamed the man she loved, blamed the scandal, blamed anything but myself. I changed my name to forget it all. But I came back to see if he had changed, if he'd made amends." Eliza's voice was steady. "And did he?" A bitter smile ghosted across his face. "He left everything to her daughter, but she never knew. She burned the letter before reading it." Eliza closed her eyes for a moment, the enormity of grief and misunderstanding settling between them like a second presence. And so it was that on a rain-washed afternoon, in the quiet civility of the village hall, she gathered those whose fragmented truths had begun to stitch themselves into a single tragic thread. Marianne, pale but resolute, Mr. Ashford, shadowed by a name he had once cast off, the postmistress who remembered odd requests and dates that no longer aligned, the widow who'd seen Clara cry by the old tree one winter morning and never spoken of it. Eliza, seated in her modest authority, began with a gentleness that made the words all the more powerful. "Sometimes the end of silence is not thunder but a breath. And in that breath, truth finds its voice." And in that moment they all understood. This wasn't about exposing secrets. It was about letting them rest, finally in the light. Everyone leaned in, not because they were told to, but because something in her voice, soft, deliberate and low like the rustling of old pages, made silence sacred. In that stillness, even the teacups seemed to stop trembling. Miss Eleanor Vane stood near the old fireplace, where the embers had long died, yet a strange warmth now pulsed through the room, not from fire, but from truth rising to the surface. Her eyes, steady and unblinking, met Catherine Lorne's with neither accusation nor pity, only that rare, unsettling kindness that comes from someone who has survived their own ghosts. "There was a letter," she began, her voice wrapped in velvet and shadow, "sent in 1934, never posted. A letter from your sister, Margaret." Catherine's hands froze mid-motion, her spoon hovering inches above her cup. "But Margaret died that year," she murmured, eyes widening. "Precisely," Eleanor said. "And yet the letter was addressed to Mr. Gilbert Harrow. It was hidden, tucked inside a false panel behind the bedroom dresser. The envelope was sealed but never stamped." The room felt colder now, the silence heavier. Catherine looked away, her breath shallow. "It was her handwriting," Eleanor continued gently. "The same loops, the same way she misspelled regret. But the contents that's what stopped me. It said, 'He knows. I heard the key turn. I must act before it's too late.'" At those words, a visible shift swept through the circle. Mrs. Dalrymple's knuckles whitened around her handkerchief. The Colonel stiffened slightly, and Reverend Hugh pressed his lips together, as though bracing for a confession not his own. Eleanor turned to Catherine again. "You thought he had killed her, that Mr. Harrow had discovered something she wasn't supposed to reveal, and when you found that letter years later, you believed it was a cry for help left too late." Catherine nodded slowly, a tear escaping the corner of one eye. "So you mailed it," Eleanor said softly. "Decades later, you had it rewritten, exact handwriting, same envelope, but you mailed it. You wanted to disturb the past, force it to speak. You wanted justice." Catherine's voice broke like glass. "I wanted the truth. I couldn't live with the silence anymore." Eleanor let the moment linger, then said, "But Gilbert Harrow didn't kill your sister. He tried to protect her, from your father." Gasp. Absolute stillness. The man you trusted, the man the town praised, he had locked her away, not in chains but in silence. He found her diary, her secrets, and the night she vanished she fled, not from murder but from shame. He told everyone she died in the lake, but she lived for 2 more years, in a sanitarium under a different name. Eleanor held up a worn photograph, blurry, faded but unmistakable. She wrote that letter not to accuse Gilbert but to warn him. Catherine's mouth trembled. "Then why didn't he say anything?" "Because he didn't know until it was too late," Eleanor replied. "And when he did, the shame consumed him." The vicar whispered. "Then who?" Eleanor turned, her gaze landing on Mr. Redmayne, who had been deathly quiet all along. "You forged the second letter, not to accuse Gilbert, but to control the narrative. You didn't want Catherine to uncover the real scandal. You didn't want her to know her father was capable of such cruelty." Mr. Redmayne's eyes dropped to the floor, his mask of calm cracking like dry porcelain. "I was trying to protect her," he said faintly. "The truth would have destroyed her." Eleanor shook her head slowly. "No, the truth sets what remains of the soul free. Lies only extend the prison." And with that, the room exhaled all at once, as if centuries of buried voices had finally been heard. Outside, the wind shifted. Inside, silence returned, but this time it felt like peace. They all leaned in, not because they were asked to, but because something ancient and unspoken shifted in the air the moment Miss Evelyn Hartley took a step forward, her presence more commanding than any raised voice. The fire crackled behind her but offered no warmth. Its glow only deepened the shadows that stretched long across the room, wrapping around each guest like the tightening grip of a memory they had tried too long to forget. She didn't glance around for approval or permission. She simply brushed a faint speck from her dark velvet sleeve, her fingers slow and deliberate, as if time itself had slowed to meet her pace. "There is something I need to share," she said, and her voice low and calm sliced through the thick silence like a scalpel, elegant, precise and impossible to ignore. "It concerns a photograph, or rather 2. The murmurs that threatened to ripple through the room died before they could begin. No one moved. Even the spoons hanging mid-air above untouched tea seemed suspended in waiting. Her gaze, sharp and steady, fell on young Thomas Braithwaite, seated stiffly near the window, his hands clenched so tightly on his lap that his knuckles had turned the color of bone. She didn't accuse him. Her eyes held no threat. Only knowledge, ancient, intimate knowledge that made Thomas flinch like a child who'd been found out. "You found it 3 months ago," she continued, "buried behind the false panel in your father's desk, the original photograph taken the night before the fire. It wasn't meant for you, but it called to you all the same. You recognized the monogram on the frame. Not your father's, not your uncle's. You assumed the worst." Thomas's lips parted slightly, as if to interrupt, but he couldn't summon the words. She pressed on, her tone softening not out of pity but precision. "You believed your mother had betrayed your father, that the fire which tore through the East Wing and took her life had been set in rage, that it was revenge disguised as accident, that your father had discovered the affair and buried the truth with the ashes." A deep, involuntary tremor passed through him, and he dropped his gaze to the floor as if ashamed of even remembering such thoughts. "So you mailed a second photograph," Evelyn said, walking slowly now, her heels clicking softly on the old wood floor. "A duplicate, a forgery, blurred edges, an altered timestamp. You hoped it would stir something, poke at the slumbering guilt of this household, force the past to speak." She stopped beside him, not towering, just present. "You weren't trying to defame her, you just didn't want her to vanish as the woman they pitied. You wanted them to remember that she had lived, that she had felt something wild, something forbidden, that she was more than a tragic headline." His whisper was barely audible. "I just wanted someone to care." She nodded slowly, with that quiet empathy reserved for those who have loved the dead too much to let them rest. "Grief," she said, turning to face the others again, "often dresses itself in suspicion when love is left unresolved." She returned to the center of the room, where a constable stepped forward, carrying a weathered envelope, the paper yellowed with time, the seal long broken. "This was found today, behind the cellar's old wine shelf. It is not addressed to Thomas, nor to any of you. It was meant for Eleanor, the woman in the photograph." Evelyn opened it carefully, and the weight of the moment pressed down like a closing tomb. "It is a farewell," she said, her voice trembling now, not from nerves but from reverence. Not of anger, but of surrender. A man in love, not with his wife but with someone he could never have. Your father, Thomas, he knew of Eleanor, and he chose silence over scandal. He let her go, not with rage but with restraint. A stunned hush swept through the room like cold wind through open windows. "The fire," she continued, "was not murder. It was negligence, faulty wiring, a heater left unattended. Your father blamed himself, not because he had struck out in vengeance, but because he had failed to act when he saw the signs of decay in the manor." But Evelyn wasn't finished. Her voice, now steel beneath silk, took on a sharper edge. "And yet," she said, locking eyes with someone across the room, "there was something that always troubled me. The second photograph, the one mailed anonymously to stir suspicion, was not only duplicated, it was manipulated, carefully, intentionally, not by Thomas." A beat. All heads turned slowly toward Mr. Alistair Fielding, the family solicitor, who sat rigid, colorless, his jaw locked tight. "It was you," Evelyn said. "You planted the forgery, hoping it would discredit the Braithwaite heir and destabilize the inheritance proceedings. You feared Eleanor's name, once unearthed, would tie too closely to the estate's rightful beneficiaries." His breath stuttered in his throat, and though he opened his mouth to deny it, no sound emerged. He had already been judged, not by court, but by the truth. "Lies," Evelyn murmured, "do not rot in silence. They ferment, and when they break, they poison everything around them." By morning Thomas was gone, left before sunrise, a lone suitcase in hand, no destination listed. All he left behind was a note for Evelyn, tucked inside the same panel where the photograph once slept. "Thank you for letting her be more than her ending." Fielding resigned within the week, citing health reasons, though everyone knew the true illness was guilt, and Evelyn Hartley, quiet as ever, returned to her home by the moors, where she spent the coming weeks tending her garden, whispering truths to her flowers, and watching as the snow melted, revealing the soil beneath. "Secrets," she said once, to no one, and to everyone, "do not die, they wait, and when the season is right, they rise." The envelope arrived without warning, unmarked, unreturnable, and heavy, not with weight but with meaning, and it sat for 3 days on the mantel of the old Fernwood cottage, untouched, watched only by the ticking eyes of the grandfather clock and the reluctant gaze of Elspeth Marlowe, who had lived in that house far too long to mistake silence for peace. The village, for its part, welcomed the postman's gossip with the usual polite disbelief. Mrs. Tilling insisted it must be from a solicitor. Mr. Dacre claimed he'd seen handwriting like that in a will once, and young Lydia Brooke murmured something about séances and unsent love letters, but no one truly knew, not even Elspeth, especially not Elspeth, who had buried so much in that house it had begun to echo like a vault. On the 4th evening, when the dusk had dimmed the garden to ash and only the scent of lavender clung to the air, she slit the envelope open with the same old brass letter opener her husband had once used on the day their son vanished 37 winters ago. Inside was not a threat nor confession, but a copy of a journal page, her son's, unmistakably his, ink-smudged and raw, dated 1 week before he disappeared into the woods behind the quarry. The words didn't accuse, they explained. Of secrets known, not told. Of a pact made in hushed tones with someone named only by initials. Of a meeting planned near the old chapel well. Elspeth read it twice, then 3 times, and when she looked up the cottage felt smaller, not because it was closing in but because the past was finally rising to its feet. No one in the village saw her leave that night, not even Miss Holling, who always watched from behind the curtains of number 7. but they noticed her garden gate swinging open in the morning, and the wildflowers on her doorstep, the ones that only grew by the chapel well, freshly cut and damp with dew. Elspeth never returned to the cottage, but the journal page remained, folded carefully inside a new envelope, forwarded once more without a return address, this time to someone else who had waited too long. And in the gentle quiet that followed, the village of Falleridge returned to its rhythms, the vicar resumed his bird-watching, the bakery ran out of lemon scones by noon, and Mrs. Pembridge, who had always claimed she could sense sorrow through brick walls, declared that old tragedies were best left to memory. But Miss Isabel Crane, the retired archivist who rarely spoke and always listened, stood by her ivy-covered window and watched the mist rise from the hills with that same stillness that knew, in every tidy town beneath polite smiles and shared tea-cakes, truth curls like smoke under doors waiting, curling, never truly gone, and in the end it wasn't a murder weapon that unraveled the story, nor a locked room clue, but something far more fragile, a letter delayed, a trust broken, a silence held too long. The heaviest wounds, Miss Crane thought, are often not the ones that bleed, but the ones that whisper. If you received a message from someone long gone, an answer you thought would never come, would you read it? Or would you let it sleep, tucked away with the other ghosts? Let us know in the comments, and as always, if this tale stirred something in you, puzzled your heart, or left a thought lingering in the quiet hours of the night, do consider joining us again for more stories where shadows speak, hearts remember, and mysteries bloom quietly, just beneath the surface. Until then, go gently, and never ignore the weight of a letter with no return.